Broadcast edition of Man and Nature produced by Batrisha Afrina. I am your host, Sheikh Muhammad Saifuddeen bin Sheikh Muhammad Salleh. Alhamdulillah, today we have another fascinating topic to be discussed. And our topic today is invasive species, a threat to biodiversity. I'm sure that many of us have heard of the term invasive species. Today's discussion will discuss this issue by primarily focusing on aquatic invasive species. And to discuss this, I'm happy to introduce this week's special guest, Dr. Intan Faraha, binti Ghani. She is Deputy Dean of Student Development, Resources and Research at the Faculty of Engineering and Life Sciences, Universiti Selangor, UNISEL. Assalamualaikum and welcome to Man and Nature, Dr. Intan.
Waalaikumsalam. Okay.
Thank you for accepting our invitation to be on Man and Nature this week.
Right, most welcome. Especially.
Right, Dr. Intan, before we start,
Okay.
I think it's best if perhaps you can share with our listeners
All right.
regarding your academic background. I
Okay.
understand your research interest is fish biology and ecology.
Okay.
How did you get interested in this field of study?
All right. Okay. So, Assalamualaikum. First and foremost, I would like to say thank you to the Shaikh for this opportunity and for inviting me to these sessions. As I can see, these sessions is a good platform for us in order to create increased awareness regarding the impact of invasive species. So, where should I start? Okay, so the background of my degree study is in aquaculture from Universiti Malaysia Terengganu. Then I continue my study in marine science at Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. Then I pursue my PhD also in aquaculture study at Universiti Putra Malaysia, but that time was my focus was on the biological aspects on one of the important native fish species, which is Puntupitis bulu, or locally known as Tenggalan. And I remember during my sampling time, I noticed the presence of the invasive species, which is the peacock bass, has been caught by the fishermen along and together with our native fish species. And when I asked the fishermen, they said that that species has been dominated that particular area, and that particular area was Perak River, and we know that Perak River is one of the major and important river in Semenanjung, Malaysia. So after I finished my PhD in 2019, so during my sampling time, that was the moment when my research interest for the invasive species started to spark. So after I finished my PhD in 2019, I continued my research on invasive species along with other researchers from UPM, UMT, USM, UTHM, and UC. Okay, so we focus on study on the invasive species, and my focus species is on the ikan bandaraya, and it's still going on until today. So my focus my focus and research area for the invasive species is on the biomonitoring of invasive fish species, which is the ikan bandaraya, by biomonitoring of these species by using the eDNA, okay, as well as developing the new product or innovations by using the invasive species. We can say to turn the waste into wealth. So that's started from my PhD. That's where my research on invasive species started to spark.
Right, Doctor. When we mention the term invasive species and when we relate the term to fish, as you have highlighted, one fish that perhaps is very familiar to many people is ikan bandaraya. And I know that many people keep this fish as a convenient species to clean up their aquarium. But usually when the fish gets too big, what they do is they will release or throw the fish away into the drain.
Yes.
And this will end up into rivers.
The river. Yes.
So perhaps to start off, could you share with our listeners, how do invasive fish species like the aforementioned ikan bandaraya, and also you also mentioned about peacock bass, how do they disrupt our local freshwater ecosystem?
Okay, so before we go further into our discussions on the impacts of the invasive fish species, we need to understand the meanings and the differences between the introduced species and the invasive species. Okay, the meaning of the introduced species is species that has been brought into their outside native range.
Okay.
Okay, Meanwhile, the invasive species is the introduced species that cause harm to the environment, to the economic, as well as to human health. So that's the differences between invasive species and introduced species. So not all introduced species are the invasive species.
Okay.
Okay, so ikan bandar raya and peacock bass is an invasive species. Okay, so and then we go to the history of invasive species in Asia. Okay, so the history of invasive fish species in Asia can be traced back to the 20th century with the introduction of Chinese carp by the Chinese immigrant to Malaya. And then the introductions of tilapia from Java to Malaya during the World War II. And then following that, there are many introduced species which has been brought to Malaysia due to various factors such as aquaculture or ornamental industry, and that species now has become the invasive and threatened our local ecosystem. So back to Dr. Your questions, how these invasive species disrupt our freshwater, our local ecosystem. So how they disrupt our local ecosystem? First and foremost, they will compete with our native species. How they compete with our native species? Okay, we took peacock bass as an example. Okay, so peacock bass, we know it is an aggressive predators which consume many organisms, which consume many types of organisms, from small fish to large fish, crustacean, as well as insects. And our native fish also consume the same resources, and it will give pressure to our native species. Okay, that is on the food competitions. And as for the habitat competition, we take an example of ikan bandar raya. Okay, ikan bandar raya, they have one kind of activity, which is the burrowing activity. Okay, when they burrow, it will cause erosion and sedimentation to the riverbank, and it will cause disruptions to our local and native fish, and it will what we can say threaten our local ecosystem, because our native fish use that habitat for feeding as well as for reproductions. So that is how the invasive species compete or disrupt our local ecosystem. Not to say we can also add on the predations. The peacock bass, as well as the bawang ikan merah, is an aggressive predator, is an apex predator. They will consume and they will attack on our native fish. And also, although we see the ikan bandar raya as a passive aquatic species with slow-moving species, there is one study that shows that these species consume other fishes, other small fishes, and their eggs. So, ikan bandar raya can become an egg predators in our local ecosystem.
Okay, so that's how dangerous or harmful these invasive species are. So what are the ecological consequences of such disruption?
Okay, so the ecological consequences of such disruptions are wide-ranging, and it can be severe. Okay, so one of the consequences that we know is the declining numbers or loss of biodiversity of our local and native species. We knew that our native species are now facing several threats, including deforestation, including overfishing, and now the presence of the invasive species. The second one is the presence of the invasive species will cause ecosystem function disruptions. So the declining or removal of native species in one particular area. Okay, we took an example of we knew that the food chain or food web is a complex matter to understand, the food chain of food web. So we take an example, a predator like bawang ikan merah or peacock bass. So when they reduce the populations of a particular prey species, for example, ikan sebarau in that area, it will definitely affect the populations, affect the predators and prey of the species, and this it will eventually altering the entire food chain. Okay, so that is how apa tu uh, uh, ecological consequences caused by the invasive species. And then, of course, when there are changes in water quality, okay, the presence of the invasive species will cause in habitat alteration. Which, as I mentioned just now, the presence of ikan malaraya will cause sedimentation due to their what we say burrowing activity. Okay, so when the erosion happens from their burrowing activity, it will increase the water turbidity, and then it will reduce the light penetrations. So the photosynthesis activity of the algae and aquatic plant will be disturbed. Okay, it will affect the habitats and further impact the entire food chain. Okay, that is for habitat alterations. And then the presence of invasive species will also cause genetic consequences to our native and local ecosystem. So how? Okay, so in some cases, invasive species can hybridize with native species, okay, which later it will lead to genetic dilutions, okay, and loss of unique genetic traits. Okay. In addition, the reductions and declining numbers of our native species will cause a genetic bottleneck. It will reduce the genetic diversity and thus making our native populations vulnerable to disease as well as to environmental changes. Okay, that is the genetic consequences. And also the presence of the invasive species will also lead to behavioral changes of the invasive species, which later will disturb our local ecosystem. So how will it happen? Okay, so the native species, they will change their habits of behavior in response to the presence of invasive species. Okay, for instance, they may alter their feeding and spawning habits. Okay, which later impact our ecosystem.
Okay. So certainly what you mentioned is something that I think most people are not aware of because this happened in the rivers, for example, and this cannot be seen by most people.
Yeah.
So what are the specific traits, doctor, that make this species a particularly problematic invasive species?
Okay. So before we start, I take ikan raya and peacock bass as an example. Okay, so we take a look into a specific traits of ikan raya. So ikan raya, there are tolerance to poor water quality. Okay, they can survive in low oxygen area. They can survive in high polluted water area. They can survive in high turbid area, in which many of our native species cannot survive. So these traits giving them the advantage to dominate that particular area. Okay. The second one is for ikan raya, as we can see, they have a strong and hard spine. So these characters and these traits protect and help to protect them from predators. That is ikan raya. Okay. So ikan raya and peacock bass is dominating our ecosystem, and these two species are originated from the Amazon. Okay, so we know Amazon area is a tropical area that is characterized by the warm temperature, high rainfall, and high humid area, similar to our local climate. Okay, so this similarity on the climate factors give credit to these species to survive and dominate our ecosystem. That is for ikan raya and peacock bass. So peacock bass, we know peacock bass or other species such as bawang ikan merah, we know it's a predator with the aggressive characters and attack predators. They can the individual of peacock bass as little as 50 mm. They can start to prey on small fishes, and the larger size of peacock bass of 200 mm, they can become fully piscivorous. They can consume larger fish. So they can ingest the whole prey. They can pass their gape size. Okay, so that is the traits that give advantage to the peacock bass or bawang merah. So and we take another example, which is the African catfish. Okay, so the special characters that they have is that they have a high reproductive rate, which allows them to quickly establish and expand their populations in in our environment. That is why African catfish were introduced into Malaysia for aquaculture purposes because of these special traits. Easy to survive, easy to grow, fast growth, and also have the high reproduction rates. So this is the special traits that makes them and give them advantage to dominate our local ecosystem.
Doctor, could you share with us what and how do certain practices inadvertently or deliberately introduce invasive species into a new environment?
Okay, so these invasive species can be introduced to our local ecosystem intentionally or unintentionally. Okay, so based on few factors. Okay, so some species like the African catfish and tilapia, they are introduced to Malaysia, as well as for other species such as bawang merah and cherak species, the red claw, the crayfish. Okay, they are introduced into our country for aquaculture purposes. Okay, due to their special traits, as what I mentioned just now, which is faster growth, high reproduction rate, and easy to growth. So they has been brought to Malaysia for aquaculture purposes. Okay, however, these species being reported escape from the aquaculture facilities due to damaged fatalities. Okay, or during extreme weather events, and now they establish their populations in the wild. Okay, that is some of the species for aquaculture industry, and some of the invasive species such as ikan menerai or peacock bass. Our country for ornamental fish industry, and sometimes some of these species are released into the environment intentionally by the pet owners. Okay, this because these species has outgrown their tanks. Okay, so they had been released to the environment, and for the peacock bass, some of the anglers, okay, I got the information. They released the peacock bass into the environment in order to create a new sport fishing. I see. For recreational fisheries, recreational, okay, leading to dominations of these species.
Right. So some are intentional, others may be unintentional release. Okay, what are some of the more effective strategies that are being used currently to control these invasive fish species, and what innovative approaches are being proposed or developed to improve these efforts?
Okay. Controlling these invasive species, okay, requires complex approach by different parties, such as the government, the NGOs, researchers, scientists, as well as communities. Okay, so in Malaysia, the management of invasive alien species is implemented through the National Action Plan on Invasive Species, and in that plan, it covers three main goals. The first one is to address public awareness on the invasive species. The second one is to conduct risk assessments on the invasive species. And the third one is to strengthen the quarantine inspection and enforcement. So in order to achieve these three main goals, okay, we need to apply for the proper management. Okay, the first one is we need to update the checklist, and we need to have an accurate data on Malaysian freshwater bodies in order to have the accurate risk assessment. Okay, we need to have an accurate and update data on the Malaysian freshwater bodies. Okay, the second one is maybe we could apply a modern technology such as biomonitoring through the eDNA in order to improve the conventional sighting methods. So what is eDNA? Maybe the audience want to know what is actually eDNA. So eDNA is the DNA that has been released into the environment. Okay, for example, via feces, via mucus, blood, and tissue. So this DNA, we can extract it from the environmental sample, such as water, such as soil and feces, without having to isolate the target organism. So we can detect the presence of the invasive species through the water samples. Okay, so the use of these eDNA methods for aquatic species, it has three major merits. The first one is it will reduce cost and working time for sampling. Okay, the second merit is it will reduce disturbance impacts on habitats, and the third merit is it will reduce safety risk for the investigator during film. Okay, that is the three major merits for eDNA biomonitoring. Okay, so in order, back to the problem management. So in order to achieve the three main goals, as I mentioned just now, okay, we can also reduce the size and populations of the invasive species by encouraging citizens and communities to catch and use these species for maybe ikan mana raya. For example, we can use them as an alternative feed to our local aquaculture industry. Okay, I did not encourage the communities to eat the ikan mana raya.
Okay.
As we know, ikan mana raya, they live in a polluted area. Okay, but we can use them as an alternative feed in our aquaculture industry. Okay, as what we conduct, our team conduct right now is the development of from alternative fish feed from ikan mana raya. Okay, and now we are actively conduct short courses and knowledge transfer program for the local farmers to use ikan mana raya flesh as a fish feed, alternative fish feed. And we also have developed a biomonitoring kit by using eDNA in order to detect the presence of what we call ikan mana raya and picotus.
Right. I understand the cost for using ikan bandara as alternative feed is
Yes.
actually helping to reduce the cost of aquaculture.
Yeah, I got feedback from the local farmers which attend our courses. They said that they can reduce the cost up to 80% by using the fish, the ikan mana raya as an alternative feed in their industry.
Okay, so it's an economically viable alternative
Yes.
for them. Out of curiosity, Doctor, we discussed this just before we came into the studio. What is the biggest size of ikan bandaraya that you have seen or you have captured?
The biggest size that have been captured by the community pemburu ikan mana raya is almost 35 to 40 cm with the weight 2 kg
Okay,
per fish.
that's very huge.
That's very huge.
No wonder they let the fish. No wonder people release the fish because it gets too big.
It gets too big. Yeah.
Okay, Doctor, we are coming to the end of our program.
Okay.
Maybe you have some concluding remarks that you would like to share with our listeners.
All right. So, in order to overcome this matter, okay, I will always say, first and foremost, public awareness is very important. We need people to understand that the impact or effects of the presence of invasive species is not only harmful to the environment, but it will also give significant impact to the economy. So we need to together collaborate with NGO, with the governments, communities, researchers, scientists to overcome this problem.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Intan, for sharing your expert views on invasive species. Inshallah, I think, and I believe actually we have gained a lot from our discussion today. Ladies and gentlemen, Islamic teachings do not explicitly address the issue of invasive species as understood in modern ecological terms. However, Islamic principles related to environmental stewardship and the treatment of living beings can be applied to the issue of invasive species. We have a few principles from Islam that we can perhaps take note of. The first principle is khilafah or stewardship, whereby Islam emphasizes that humans are stewards or khalifa on this planet, and this role includes the responsibility to maintain the balance and harmony of the environment. And if we introduce invasive species, that means we are doing harm to the ecosystem, which can be seen as neglecting our duty as Khalifa on this earth. The second principle is La Darar wa La Dirar, which is a principle in Islamic jurisprudence regarding harm prevention. This principle focuses on the need to prevent harm and not inflict harm on others. Invasive species often cause significant harm to native species and ecosystems, as explained by Dr. Intan earlier. Thus, taking measures to control or prevent the spread of invasive species aligns with this principle. The third principle is ihsan, which is respect for all creatures and creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this most definitely includes maintaining the balance and integrity of natural habitats. Allowing invasive species to disrupt these habitats is contrary to the respect owed to Allah's creations. And finally, the fourth principle is mizan, or balance and moderation. Islam emphasizes the concept of mizan in the natural world, and humans are enjoined to maintain this balance. Invasive species disrupt this balance, leading to harm in the ecosystem. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time that we have for this week's edition of Men and Nature. Before we end, allow me to express my gratitude to our special guest today, Dr. Intan Faraha, binti Ghani. Thank you again, Dr. Intan, for your wonderful and insightful sharing.
Most welcome.
And I hope that we will have other opportunities to meet again on the air, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Ladies and gentlemen, as always, I hope that our discussion has provided much information and benefits to all who have been following the program. For the last 30 minutes, you have been listening to Men and Nature. I'm Sheikh Muhammad Saifuddeen with Sheikh Muhammad Salleh, signing off until next week. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalam.